Everyone for putting up with good talks and a lot of technological problems. And actually thanks to the organizers for not only organizing it, but bravery under fire as we try and finish this off. Thank you. In about a decade ago, I wrote a paper with Chris Peterson that went into the Peter Sale book that decried the death of behavioral ecology of reef fishes, saying that there's virtually nothing being published anymore in it. And it turned out that I was wrong, dead wrong. There's lots that's going on. It's just changed its face a little bit. And rather than being pure science, a lot of behaviorists have turned their attention to, well, how important might behavior be in this changing world? How important might it be in terms of the changing role of management as we concentrate now more on spatial management rather than simple single-species fisheries? And what I want to do today is run very quickly through three different aspects of the lives of fishes. Learn patience. Three aspects that affect production, demography of fishes that are also affected by behavior. And those three aspects are growth, reproduction, and recruitment. I'm not going to, this isn't a full review of everything, but I want to give you a flavor of how important behavioral aspects might be in our considerations of management and conservation. Growth is a fairly easy one to describe how it might be. Yeah, okay. How it might be important in eventual production of fishes, and it's easy actually to connect it to behavior. Fishing very often removes high-level predators. The establishment of reserves often restores them. And what we really need to know is what happens then to the ecosystem as we either are removing predators through intensive fishing or restoring predators in terms of establishing usually spatial management. And most of the attention, a lot of the attention so far has been placed on numerical responses. That is, more predators mean that they eat more, there'll be less of something else, and maybe more of the thing that it eats. On the other hand, behavior has the possibility of being even more pervasive and perhaps more effective in terms of changing energy transfer in these reef ecosystems. That's simply because feeding is a risky thing to do. Animals will adjust their feeding behavior in relation to the risk, and there's a simple relation that's been around for a long period of time. That equation that's on the bottom of the slide. It's simply illustrative of the fact that you have a certain minimum amount that you have to feed in order to maintain yourself. Optimal amounts of feeding really depend on the amount of risk that you're willing to undertake. Risk is a funny thing. If you take risks, and I go into a population and try and see, well, what's the result? Well, often it seems like, well, these guys are doing very well. That's because I'm looking at the individuals that took the risk and survived. The other individuals aren't there because they're dead. And so the management of risk and its effects on feeding behavior and then subsequently on growth are something that can be extremely important. I'm going to give you some examples of that. But the first thing I want to emphasize is that risk avoidance and these sorts of behaviors are something that can happen to every member of a trophic level. It's not just removing one or two individuals through predation. It's something that can happen simultaneously over entire assemblages of fishes. And the responses can be nearly instantaneous. We don't have to wait for adaptation. We don't have to wait for long periods of time. Changes in morphology, as we just heard about. These can happen really quickly. What are the consequences? Well, if you're good at it, you'll have a lower mortality rate than if you took higher amounts of risk. But you're not feeding at an optimal level anymore. And that should lower your growth and potentially your reproductive rates. Often individuals are forced to feed in situations where they're in competition with other individuals, in feeding arenas, places that provide shelter. And that behavior can essentially limit the amount of energy going up to the predators, much more than if all the prey are exposed. And it's much more of a limited by predator handling time. So here's the context. I want to take you through 2 or 3 different places in this chain, talking first of all about the increase or decrease of predators because of increased fishing or decreased fishing, say in reserves, and how that might affect prey behavior and subsequent growth. We'll talk some about the effect on lowering or raising the density of predators themselves through fishing activities or the activity of higher level predators. And I'll also talk about prey food distribution as well. It's a great example of work done by my co-author Liz Madin, and she is going to take all the questions afterwards, who's just down here. From the Line Islands, it's a nice system because it's not a system where we're putting in reserves. It's a system that was essentially pristine in some areas, essentially have never had any human or much human activity around them. That's Palmyra Island in the top. Through a series of other islands that have been experiencing increasing amounts of human population and decreasing amounts of the things that humans eat. So that if we compare Tabaran to Christmas to Palmyra, there's a tremendous difference in the population density and a mirroring difference in the total amount of predators that are there. If we look at what the prey species do in response to the presence of predators, it's very dramatic. The y-axis in every one of these cases is excursion size. It's just how far away an individual will venture in its feeding activities away from shelter. And the fact that individuals can venture quite far away in the absence of predation indicates that this might be a good thing to do. It might increase feeding rates. But in the presence of predators, as we go out on the x-axis for all these different species, the excursion sizes become extremely small. So in fish low predator sites, we have a wide range of excursion sizes. Fishes don't always go a long ways from shelter, but sometimes they do, and they can and do. And at predator-rich sites, which are unfished in this case, there's none with large excursions. They're all staying pretty close to home. So as places are fished out, we may find larger excursions of these prey species and a consequent change potentially in their growth rates and potentially in the distribution of the food that they eat. So this was an example of fishing gradually increasing with population density in places that were formerly unfished. We can ask the same question that I know all the resilience people love to ask, is if we go the other way and now begin to allow predators to return in the sense of spatial management and marine reserves, do we get the same sort of return of response in the prey populations? To look at that, Liz and a number of us looked at the same sort of excursions in areas of the Great Barrier Reef, south, north, mid, and compared the responses of these prey to the presence of predators, now increasing inside of reserves versus not so high outside of reserves, and just compared that to the Line Islands data. And this graph simply says what's the difference in a predator-rich versus a predator-free area in excursion size, is how far away you get from your shelter, versus how different is it in terms of the number of predators around. And they all fall on essentially the same line, which suggests that, first of all, in every instance, predation risk appears to impose an upper limit on risk-taking, and there's a concordance between both the forward and backward pathways. Okay, so what? They're not going as far. It seems like they would like to go as far. So are they actually paying a cost by being risk averse? We have some data for growth rates for the Line Island species collected by a group at Santa Barbara and at Scripps Institution. That's just been submitted. And so I can't give you a graph of it because it's not my stuff. But qualitatively, there's no clear patterns of change in abundance. Interestingly enough, high predation versus low predation sites, that is an abundance of prey species. And some prey species certainly had lower rates of growth at high predation sites. None had higher rates of growth. So there's some evidence that this being risk averse will result in lower growth rates. There's some other evidence from the Great Barrier Reef and in the very extensive work that Nick Gust and Howard Choate did in the early 2000s. And there we see the same pattern, but it may not be for the same reason. Prey species definitely have lower growth rates at high predation on the outer shelf sites. As you can see, it's the lower line for all of those growth curves. On the other hand, I think Nick would say that the prey are he did say in the paper, the prey are also at higher densities there, and so perhaps that explains the low growth rates. Howard Choate last week said, nah, as Howard would. It's certainly due to the fact that they're hiding all the time and not feeding as well. So these are data that are compatible with that explanation, but they're not definitive. Thank you. So let's look now at the distribution of the food of the prey itself. Now this has an interesting aspect to it. I can show you some fish behavior here. There's this is not going to go very well because I can't change it. There's the behavior. There's the fish going away from structure. Ugh. This is a very slow-moving fish. I don't think his aspect ratio quite matches the... So there's a certain area that a fish is willing to venture away from shelter. That area is smaller under high predation situations. So we could end up with a situation, now it's going to go off, of course, where if foraging is concentrated around areas of shelter, there will be areas that have no herbivory going on in it, and so therefore we should end up with a more heterogeneous distribution of food resources. Any difference? I can handle it. If we look at the macroalgal distribution at high risk and low risk sites, like Christmas and Palmyra, you can see eventually you can see a difference in the amount of crop substrate. There are areas that aren't being cropped in these high risk areas, and large macroalgal patches in the high risk areas. So it looks like there is some evidence that we get a difference in the distribution and actually the density of the resources that the prey are using that reflect their willingness to venture away from sites. All right, let me talk quickly about reproduction. How are you doing, Phil? All right, I feel good. Now we're going to talk about predators more than anything else. If fishing changes the density of predators, or higher level predators can change the density of mesopredators. And, this is doing it by itself, it's so wonderful. Here's a good example of effects on mating systems of a Caribbean hogfish. This is some work done by Roldan Munoz just this year. Outside of marine reserves, there are many fewer fishes. No surprise. This is a fish species. They move around a lot more, But most importantly, even with the most intense observations that they could do, there was absolutely no spawning that went on at all. So they had nearly 3 times as much effort on the outside, looking everywhere to try and all the likely places for spawning, and it just simply did not occur. The only spawning that was observed were in situations where social systems were intact, and that was only inside of reserves. Mark that mentioned sex change responses. That's another form of behavior. Individuals will respond if they're changing sex from female to male to the absence of larger males. They'll either respond very quickly and agilely to this, or it looks like sex change may be more of a fixed response. There are 2 different patterns then. For species that have highly responsive social control of sex change, females will change to males when the large males are taken out. This has an interesting effect because you can't just keep making more fish. You're just simply reducing the size range of fishes, and you're changing the sex ratio. So you end up with a greater male to female sex ratio. So here's a good example from before fish sites and after fish sites for the California sheephead. And the black bars are the size distributions of males, the white bars for females, and you can see for each of these situations, but particularly for Catalina and San Nicolas, you end up with a left-shifted size distribution. That's no surprise, but a very different sex ratio and a consequent much lowering of the production of species. There's simply fewer and fewer females. On to this, which is another example of a sex-changing fish that is not very responsive to the removal of males. And in this case, we end up with a dearth of males. The male-female sex ratio actually decreases as males are removed and females don't move in to take their place. And in this case, we can still be in trouble because we can end up with situations where males are faced with females with so many females that they actually have never evolved to be able to service this many females. So you can see the distribution of females to males in 1992 after some heavy fishing for about a dozen years in this gag grouper. And the sex ratio there is somewhere between 10 and 20 to 1. The normal sex ratio in the species is about 4 females to every male. And Chris Koenig is now getting lots of evidence of increased fertilization rates. There just isn't enough sperm to go around. Finally, I'd like to talk about recruitment. Once you grow and are able to reproduce, you produce these babies. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be successful. Those young have to get back to the reef and they have to grow up, as Mark was talking about. This is interesting. I'm really being paced here quite strongly. This is some work done by Stallings on the presence and absence of NASA groupers. These are all experimental situations where he increased or decreased the density of this large predator down here, the NASA grouper, and its effect on mesopredators, smaller ceranids. These are young of the year ceranids, so they're not very big, and they eat recruits. When in the presence of this large predator, these individuals hide a lot. Gotcha. They stay in protected areas. They don't forage away from their shelter. Sound familiar? This has an interesting effect. This is one of the few examples I know of where we really do have a documented growth effect that appears to be due to the fact that they are not foraging outward very much. So in the presence of the NASA grouper, these smaller ceranids have a lower growth rate. And because they are the predators of recruits, in this lower graph here is an example of what happens in terms of survival of recruits in the presence or absence of this large predator, which suppresses the activity of the mesopredators. And we end up with much higher survival rates of these recruits in the presence of the large predators. So this is an example of behavior of predators affecting survival of recruits. There's also an example that Mark McCormick just showed me about 10 days ago of the response of recruits themselves to the presence and absence of predators. And that is in the presence of predators, or the smell of predators, whether they've been eating recruits or not, one way or the other, the recruits will not tend to settle in areas where predators are present. So that may mean that we'll get a redistribution of recruits. It may mean that there will be a higher mortality of recruits. But one way or the other, the behavior of these individuals can strongly affect the distribution and survival of these recruits. So the bottom line, just to conclude, is pay attention to behavior. I think we need to. Fishing has always paid attention to behavior. Fishing is about fish behavior. Gear design, gear regulation depends on what fishes do. Habitat selection, spatially specific regulations, spawning season, spawning aggregations all reflect fish behavior. That's no surprise. What I want to emphasize today, if I can get the slide, will be that conservation measures must control for behavioral effects as well. They really have to think about this. They can be of equal or greater magnitude to the numerical responses that we've come to expect. They can counteract or they can accentuate the numerical effects themselves. They can be pervasive, affecting every individual within the trophic level, and they can occur nearly instantaneously. So these can be large effects. It's not just something that fish do. And it doesn't just affect growth and mortality, as we saw. It can also affect very significantly both reproduction and recruitment. So pay attention to it. Thanks.